Welcome to the May edition of our Economy, Markets and Investments webinar, where we will bring you a summary of Sundaram Mutual's views on what's happening in the economy and in the markets and what we should do from a future perspective. I hope you're able to see the screen that I'm sharing, right? So let me now move on. So the focus on India, despite all the news that's happening around the second wave, is that we still view India as riding the recovery, right? So what do I mean by this? So let's look at the second wave. That's the top of mind for all of us. And if you now look at it, right, what was the concern? The concern is that the second wave, where its severest impact was, right, in the states of Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Karnataka, and to a lesser extent in Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, these states are ranking in the top five in terms of the contribution to India's GDP, right? So if you take the nominal contribution, these states are almost half of India's GDP. And those were precisely the states which were affected by the second wave, right? So definitely the earlier assumptions behind the GDP growth for the current year have necessarily had to be revised. Before this, the market was talking about 12.5% GDP growth for the year, but we are now seeing anywhere between various analysts, various economists have given different rates of correction, varying between 100 to 200 pips. So we are now talking of roughly a 10% this way, that way by half a percent GDP growth, right? But still people have not factored in what kind of a pent-up demand can come when the lockdowns, this time, there has been no central lockdown. Each state has taken a different path to what type of lockdown and how do you implement it. And we are already seeing that there are indications of the second wave peaking, most notably Mumbai and Maharashtra, I think has now crossed the hump, and we are going to see a gradual easing of restrictions, right? So that has not been priced in because we'll have to wait and see that impact, right? So that's the summary of what the second wave impact has been. Where has the impact been in terms of this? So e-way bills, right? That's a key one which was showing a strong V-shaped recovery. As you can see from the last month, you started to see a kind of easing or a softening on the e-way bills. The next one is in the PMI, the Purchase Managers Index. So both the services PMI and the manufacturing PMI showed a sharp V-shaped recovery, and then you can see there's been a flattening and some level of moderation. So these are all the impacts, and these will be trends which with the month of May, when the data comes out, will see this trend, because May has been the month where the second wave has seen the worst impact. So the next month's data will reflect a continuation of this moderation trend, right? But there is also positive news even despite this. The GST collections, even in the month of April, despite the second wave, have witnessed a continued and robust uptick, as you can see, right? The good news in terms of this whole thing has been also the crude impact. So the average of petrol and diesel prices in the month of April saw a 7% correction, right? So overall, from an input cost perspective, and for that, it's been impact on the inflation, it's been good there, right? The other thing is that the state has stepped up. Earlier, we were exporting the vaccines. We stopped that. We are now trying to increase the amount of vaccinations. Government has announced the 18 to 45. Yes, it's not sufficiently available that everybody above 18 is not able to get vaccinated. But if you look at the current vaccination trend, the bottom light blue shaded graph is where both doses of vaccine have been done. So that, as you can see, the percentage is about 3% of our population. But at least one dose, which gives partial protection, at least 10% of the population has been covered, right? So this trend of increasing vaccinations, we expect it to continue. And if you now look at it on what the current rate continues, that's the blue dotted line. If the current rate continues, if 70% of the population is to be vaccinated, which is the number at which you will think that herd immunity will set in and the country as a whole will be able to comfortably manage the COVID virus as an influenza or any other viruses like measles and smallpox, which in the past affected, which once you have herd immunity in the population, you can assume that life will come back to near normal. So if the current rate of vaccination continues, we are seeing that July 2022, a year from now, is when we will achieve that herd immunity. However, if the vaccination rate slows, this could be put back by another 9 months to April 2023. But if, as they believe, the government can double the rate of vaccinations because you stopped exporting, we are in fact importing the Sputnik vaccine. We are looking at giving approval to Moderna and Pfizer to come in also. We are allowing the states to also float global tenders to get vaccines. If that succeeds at double the rate, then we can say that even by the end of this calendar year. Why do I put these scenarios? Because that's the way the market will react. So if there's a doubling of the rate of vaccination, then 2021 calendar year itself, we would have achieved that. And next year, we can look forward to life as normal. So please bear in mind that this rate of vaccination is a key determinant of how long these moderations and slowdowns that you're seeing will continue and when we can expect that demand pickup to come through, right? Supporting this, right, in terms of this is the RBI's balance sheet expansion. I think that's an unique critical part because one of the biggest pluses behind this whole and why the markets have been by and large buoyant despite the bad news around the medical side and the economy side has been the fact that RBI and the government have worked hand in hand. There has been no disconnect, as has happened many times in the past. The government thinks one way and the RBI thinks another. That's not been the case. So RBI has fully supported the government by taking steps and measures right before the government itself has acted. The RBI has very often acted. So the first thing is they have flooded the system with liquidity, which has helped enormously in easing the corporate burden. It has helped enormously in banks getting a lot of money so that there is no shortage of funds wherever they feel they can lend. So first is the liquidity. The second is the rate cutting. So RBI's rate cutting, so as you can see here, has resulted that in bank lending rates for fresh loans, which is the blue line, and existing loans also, there has been a average rates have been trending down. So many people believe that banks are not cutting for existing borrowers. Not true. Banks have actually been cutting even to existing borrowers. Naturally, for new loans, the competitive element is greater and the rate cuts have been sharper. So overall, the banks have passed on a significant amount of the soft rates they got and the liquidity support they got to the ultimate corporate borrowers, right? Plus, RBI, besides the liquidity, besides the rate cuts, RBI has also announced the resolution framework right in last year instead of a third moratorium, the Kamath committee, which has also greatly helped in easing the NPA burden for the banks, but also helping the corporates not to face a sudden big repayment to be made to the banks on account of the moratorium expiring. So the very proactive RBI has helped that the banks have also then smartly, what have they done? They have increased their provision on NPLs to take care. What does it mean? Because banks got extra profits from the easy liquidity, soft loan rates, soft rates that RBI lent to them meant that they were sitting on a comfortable position on their net interest margin. So they used the opportunity to increase the provision so that when the actual repayments come through, if the news is not as bad, this can actually be written down back to their profits of the bank in future years and quarters. So this is a good thing from a bank perspective that they have been very cautious. In fact, specifically for COVID, if you see, they have made about 1 to 1.5. Of course, Bandhan Bank being an original microfinance institution made 2.5% provision just for COVID, right? So this is the smartness and the proactiveness of the banks, which has also given comfort. And so overall collection efficiency of the large banks are all still in the mid 90s. So overall, I think we can still say that we have a very sound banking system post the COVID crisis, right? So naturally, as a result, right, we will see that the V-shaped recovery that you've been talking about, it's still on course. So from a quarter perspective, this quarter, that is April, May, June quarter, we expect a 28% year-on-year GDP growth. despite the second wave, because the base effect last year was negative 24%. So because on a negative base you're growing, you're going to show. But don't worry too much about these quarters. Is the overall expectation for the year that we are looking at. And like we said, RBI is talking about 10.5. Markets are a little more range bound, but the second wave is going to moderate this by 100 to 200 bips, as I already mentioned, right? So now this is the story of the immediate future, right? In terms of how the vaccinations will occur, what is the level of correction that will take place immediately, what is the level of bounce back that will take place because of the pent up demand coming through, maybe by Diwali if the doubling the rate of vaccination happens. But as market participants, we cannot afford to simply get lost in the near term concerns. Why do I say this? As market participants, as partners or as investors, right? When you invest money, each investor is investing to his timeline. So suppose you have a 5-year outlook as we expect mutual fund investors to have. Suppose you have a 10-year outlook as we expect a provident fund to have. Suppose you have a 20-year outlook as we expect a pension fund, FIIs I'm talking about, to have. They will look beyond the current to see what is the long-term outlook for the Indian economy. And short-term money also takes advantage of the fact that long-term players are buying this. So there is no way that you can take a market view without looking at the medium-term outlook. And in India's case, that medium-term outlook is driven by three structural positives, which we must understand in detail and track to see whether those positive effects are getting delayed or are they on course, depending on which you can form your sectoral views also on the market. So three structural positives which I've outlined here are housing, the production linked incentive PLI scheme, and the national infrastructure pipeline. So let's take a quick tour around this to understand why the markets are remaining buoyant despite the bad news around the second wave. The reason for that is that, first of all, this easy liquidity of RBI lending into lending rates, you saw the big drop in fresh lending rates, means that home loans have become very, very affordable. So if you take an affordability index and calculate it, you will see that today we are at 27% of a person's salary income or monthly income is all that he needs to buy a house, an affordable house. The last time that we saw such a level was in 2004. So you are almost seeing a 17-year low in terms of the affordability, or 17-year high in terms of how affordable this is. So now when you see here, right, why I've taken Mumbai as an example, because there was also on the news for the stamp duty that they reduced. And you can see that today a property price, EMI to income, I told you 29 to 27, but the property price to income ratio is also as low as 4.2, so much so that if you take the interest rate tax adjustment that you get when you let out your house, forget about just occupying a house to stay in it. When you buy a housing loan, take a housing loan and rent out the house, you get a tax break on the interest that you pay. You get a rental yield from the property. The gap between the two, obviously it's not a surplus. Obviously you have to put something from your monthly income. But that gap between the two in 2012 was 7% almost. Today that gap is only 3%. Which means if you just put 3% of your monthly income as additional towards the EMI, you can go and buy a house to rent out, right? So this is a huge, huge advantage, right, for boosting the housing. Why did I put housing as a structural positive? Because a house, one single house being built, gives a boost to 10 different industries. The cement industry, obviously, the steel industry, obviously, the housing loan industry, obviously, the real estate construction industry, obviously. But apart from these very obvious ones, if you delve a little more, if the paint industry gets a boost, the wood industry gets a boost, right? Interior decorations. The tiling industry gets a boost, right? The PVC pipe industry gets a boost. The sanitary ware industry gets a boost. The electrical wiring, whether it's copper or aluminum, they get a boost. So as you can see, I've listed out a number of things. So housing has a huge multiplier effect. So housing, because of all these factors, is going to be one of the key drivers of GDP growth for India for a long time to come. That's number one. Next, we talked about the PLI. What is this? The production linked incentive. What is this the government is doing? The government has said that in specific sectors that they have identified, which some of which are listed here, the government is going to give somewhere between 5 to 6% of the value addition. What is value addition? You dig out iron ore from the ground, right? That raw iron ore, there is no value addition. When you convert iron ore to steel, when the steel gets converted to a scooter or a motorcycle or a car, that's when the value addition happens. Of the value addition that you add from the iron ore that you extract, you will be given 5 to 6% for 5 years as a cash incentive by the government. So where are we doing it? We want to attract foreigners to come to India and set up a manufacturing plant, right? So the GDP impact of this is almost 1.8% of GDP that's expected. Right now, these are the sectors in the initial lot. The government is going on expanding this, and something like $150 billion in new sales and $70 billion in domestic value addition is what is expected to result from the PLI scheme. So obviously, this PLI is nothing but the old Make in India refashioned, made very specifically more attractive with direct cash component. So this will give the manufacturing sector a big boost. What is the impact of this? That India is going to become a net exporter of, for example, phones, one of the industries that we have looked at in the PLI, right? And so if you look at it, right, it is the most advanced worldwide. If you see, it is the most advanced, and the global producers are going to receive the most incentives from the PLI scheme, right? And right, India's exports and imports, we import components and then re-export them. The electronic import stands at 25% of electronic imports. This has doubled from the 13% that we saw in December 17. This index movement brings out the sharp pace of growth on the electronics. I've just chosen one of the PLI industries to show the impact, right? The third impact, and why the PLI was announced now, I'll come to wait if you'll be patient with me. But right now, I want to shift to the third sectoral driver, because that's also closely linked with what I want to say, which is that the national infrastructure pipeline. What is the amount? Something like 1 lakh crore rupees. Trillion rupees is what they talk about. Is 1 lakh crore rupees is planned for the 2020 to 25 by the government of India, of which where are they split up? The infrastructure pipeline is going to be energy sector, urban sector, road sector, and railway sector will account for 70%. So this infrastructure pipeline, which obviously has to be financed somewhere, part of it will be from the budgetary allocation every year, but also from foreign direct investment. So as we shift now to see that the engineering and construction industry, right, all of this which is a part of this pipeline, already you're seeing that it has started bottoming out. And because foreign capital is important to finance this whole sector, whether it's PLI, whether it's NIP, whether it's housing, what the government has done well before, 2 years before, was to cut our tax rates to among the lowest in the world. So as you can see from this clear thing, 35% to 17%, today we are at par with the best in the world, which is Singapore and Poland, right? We are equal, if not better than them on tax rates for new manufacturing. So this is a way to get foreign capital into these industries. Second, this why this NIP was important is because to get the foreigners to come and manufacture, you have to get your infrastructure up in place. That is a work in progress, but we have already made a lot of progress, because on ease of doing business, we have improved our ranking 79 ranks over the last 5 years. So that's why that infrastructure pipeline is important, because unless you make the speed to the port from the manufacturing destination as short as possible, foreigners are going to hesitate to come to India. So this continuing improvement in our ease of doing business is an important tracker. We have made progress, but there's still a long way to go. That's why the NIP is so important. And why all of this at this point in time is because structurally, India is sitting in a sweet spot compared to the manufacturing capital of the world for the last decade and a half, China, right? So what this is that this China plus one as a strategy has suddenly come into the world. All those global manufacturers and countries which were sourcing from China are now looking at a China plus one. Why is China plus one important? Because of this graph. What does this graph tell you? The red line tells you China's working age population. The blackish blue line tells you India's working age population. And the dotted line on the red tells you when the working age population start to decline, because people get older, new people are not getting produced at the same rate. Because China implemented a one family, one child policy many years ago. In 2017 itself, the red line has started declining, which means China, the older people are going out of the workforce, but not enough new people are joining. From 2017, China's working age has started to decline, whereas India is still on a rising trend. When is our decline? 2050, which means for 30 years, we are going to be having a situation of a rising and increasing working age population, which means from a labor supply perspective, compared to China, India is in a sweet spot. So when global manufacturers are looking at China and saying, hey, Chinese labor is coming down, I need to have a plus one to China, India is in a good position to capture. Not guaranteed that 100% are going to come to India, but we are there available. Now, that's why the tax rate cut, that's why the PLI scheme, everything is to grab this opportunity from China plus one, is India is gearing itself to become ready, right? And so FDI, when this manufacturing plant comes in, it comes as permanent capital, which is called FDI. So if you look at the gross FDI, you can look at the black line, which is a 12-month trailing sum as a percentage of GDP. It's now shot up to 3%. And the absolute FDI, which is given there, as you can see, is now about $80 billion, the largest. So this graph tells you that very, very clearly, that our current FDI for this is every quarter, but for the year, we have got $81 billion, which is the highest ever in a year. So all these tax cuts and all these things that the government has done on ease of doing business have already started taking effect. Now this FDI, when it comes in, and then it will come and break it out into manufacturing, which will then give a contribution to GDP. So step one is for the FDI to be announced and to come in. So we are already seeing that the government's action. So when this FDI flow keeps sustaining is where our capex cycle will get a boost, and I will cover that now. So how big has this shift been? If you look at it and compare to just 2 years, 3 years ago, which is fourth quarter 2018 or second quarter 2018, of all the countries in the world competing with China, we have seen a 22% rise. Nobody else is anywhere near. Hong Kong has got an 8% rise, but that's just a sister country to China. Singapore has got 4%. So you can see that FDI flows, right, inflows into Asia. India is already the fastest growing in terms of share of FDI flows. And the reason this has happened is because while there's a long-term structural China plus one story, in the short term, because of the COVID, that gave a trigger to push for people to look outside China. So as you can see from here, 44% of the people in manufacturing in China say that this COVID has caused them to increase their intention to relocate, and the relocation intentions are in terms of investing in new production facilities. The center graph, you can see how from December 2018 to March, it just changed, right? So as a result, our country is now on a state of cyclical recovery coming to boost our country. So this year's 10.5, next year's will be 6.5. Now you may say, oh, why is our GDP growth dropping from 10.5 to 6.5? No, the 10.5 was because of the bad 2020, which was -7. A 6.5% GDP growth is a fantastic growth for a country of the size of India. And I believe that if this sustains, we will hit 8% in 2023. And by 2025, we should be on a double-digit GDP growth if all of these plans come through on time. Right? And that's why the budget building all the right natives in terms of the capex push was very critical, and that's why the markets responded so strongly to the budget and growth. Those key highlights are given. I've covered it in past webinars, so I'm not going to focus on the budget except to say that that was the trigger that this year Nirmala Sitharaman used. And so if you now look at it, right, the capex formation of the government is key, but more from an incremental perspective. Actually, India's capital formation is equally divided between the private corporate sector and the household sector at 38 and 37. So 75% of India's capital formation actually comes from corporate. The share of government is only 13, but that 13 is a trigger, is a catalyst. Because government builds a road, it gives an order to the private cement company. A person builds a house, he gives an order to the private. So the individual household sector plus the sector are the real ones driving the capex, as you would have realized from the previous slides, right? So if you then see that gross capital formation in the country has already gone through a V-shaped recovery. Can you see that gross fixed capital formation, the dark blue bar, right, was so negative to less negative to now actually turning positive. And why this has happened is because capacity utilization has bottomed out in our country. Because private capital, when will the private somebody, Hero Motors, when will he expand his capacity? When his existing capacity is getting near to full utilization. So capacity utilization trend is important to track to figure out when will the private sector come and put fresh capacity. So we are happy to see that the red dotted line capacity utilization has started going up the right hand side. Can you see it had dropped to 45%? It's now cost to 65. As it grows, the peak for our country is about 81 in 2011. So this capacity utilization cycle is another important to track for private sector capex, right? And so if you saw from the budget, where did the government plan to spend? Road, railways, defense, water, and housing. Very similar to the National Infrastructure Pipeline 5-year plan. This budget is also key to show that 25% YOY growth in these key sectors, right? And the share of the states, right? 84% of the share is still going to revenue expenditure. But what is important is that the 14% capital expenditure is being hiked up to 16% capital expenditure from the state government's perspective. In fact, if you see the percentage growth, right, compared to total expenditure growing at 16 and revenue at 13, capital expenditure for the states is to grow at 37%. So you can see that even the governments have aligned their thing to support the capex story, right? So now we move to the markets. But before we look at our markets, it's important to look at the macro. What do you mean by the macro? Because markets, as you know, FII flows, as you know, are supported by what's happening in the international world. So you can't look at our markets without looking at the macro picture. So from a macro picture, what is happening? First of all, the post-COVID recovery in the rest of the world is well entrenched, and there's a synchronous recovery happening. Almost 1.7 billion doses of vaccines have already been administered worldwide. The positive Brexit deal and the democratic sweep augur well for the capex story there to also grow. However, the liquidity flood is going to continue. I'm just summarizing some of these. I'll show you as slides, right? And centrally, they're going to add about $300 billion a month of liquidity to support this recovering growth. However, that liquidity means that twin deficits, that is the fiscal deficit and the current account deficit in markets like the US are going to widen, which has a negative impact on the dollar, which is very important from our markets perspective. Why? I shall now delineate, right? So Why? Because both the liquidity pumping and the dollar weakness give a fillip to emerging market equities, where India is also a part. Commodities have seen a strength because of Chinese growth, but Chinese credit cycle is moving closer to the peak. So we don't expect further sustained commodity rally based on the Chinese story, right? And output gaps in all economies are not closing. There is enough room that growth can grow without making inflation grow. What is the output gap? It is the gap between demand and supply, right? So while liquidity is driving earnings and multipliers higher, from our perspective, I'll come back to that later, right? So I talked about the 1.7 billion vaccines. As you can see, the world has done so much. Asia is there. India is somewhere 190 million vaccines. The dollar weakens at every size of the fiscal deficit. So as you can see, I've plotted here current account deficit and fiscal deficit, the percentage of GDP for the US versus the dollar index. And you can see the close correlation that as when the fiscal deficits rise, the dollar weakens. Why is this important? Because when there's a weak dollar, right, emerging markets, stock markets outperform. So I plotted the DXY, which is dollar versus X and Y, that is all currencies, versus the S&P 500 and the emerging market index, right? So if you see MSCI, emerging market, can you see how closely the correlates? So every time the fiscal deficits worsen and the dollar weakens, emerging market equities rise, right? Why does it do? Because of the capital flows, right? The liquidity which comes not only weakens the dollar, but also makes the, so this is a dollar index versus emerging market capital flow. So as the dollar weakens, emerging market flows rise. That's the reason of the emerging market outperformance. Plus for India, what this has meant with these liquidity and the flows are average holdings of US dollar, which is our foreign exchange reserve, has been continuously rising. As you can see, the reserves are at about $600 billion. And because of this, as a country, from a credit rating perspective, our import cover from 9 months has doubled to 18 months, which means we have enough foreign exchange currency to cover 1.5 years of import cover. So it gives added strength to a strength of India. And this liquidity, which is $13 trillion for the last year, by December 22 is going to be $29 trillion. So this further pumping of liquidity means that the dollar will continue to stay weak, and so emerging market equities will continue to stay strong, right? So especially the US is a big share of this liquidity. You can see almost $9 trillion of this 29, a quarter of this has coming from the Fed, right? So that's where this is also showing that the Fed has expanded its balance sheet almost 77% over the last year, and the same thing they did in the previous. To tell you that they will continue to do this is the expectation of the world, and which augurs well for our stock markets, right? So these India's earnings, so the funny thing is that this global liquidity is very strongly correlated not just to stock market performance, but to corporate earnings growth in India. Now you'll wonder why. I'm just showing you this result. It's a very unexpected thing. The reason for this is that when the global liquidity comes, two things happen, which I will demonstrate through this, right? EPS growth for various sectors from FY11 to 15, right? And 15 to 20. Can you see how the 9 versus 3? So what has happened is that the debt and disruption, EPS growth CAGR for various affected sectors in India means that the NSE 500 net worth, right? What has happened? You've seen that financial year 20 to half year finance, there's a 7% rise in their net worth, but their debt has come down from 28 to 27. So their debt equity ratio has improved. This is what global liquidity means, that two things. One is they bring interest rates down. So the cost of borrowing comes down, number one. Number two, when that comes in and the equity markets are buoyant, the stock market companies, which though you may call it a small cap within the FTSE 500, they're still among the larger companies in India, because the whole MSME sector and the unorganized sector is still accounts for a large part of India. Is these premium companies are able to tap the capital markets for equity. So when they raise their equity, their interest cost comes down first because of low interest rates. Second, because the amount of debt in their balance sheet comes down, but straight away results in their EPS improving. So you can see that this liquidity, on the one hand, through a weak dollar, comes in and helps, flows come in, but that flows coming in means that actually earnings grow up better, and hence those valuations look even more attractive. So this is an important point from a macro perspective, remember. So with that macro in mind, right, what is the story to summarize? The world is recovering, but the recovery is not so fast enough as to make inflation a worry. So because inflation is not a worry and they want growth to be supported, the Japanese, European, and the US central banks are going to continue to pump liquidity. As they pump liquidity, what happens is that the fiscal deficits will rise. When the fiscal deficits rise, the dollar weakens. When there is a weak dollar, capital flows out of those markets into emerging markets. And within the markets, when this capital flows, interest rates come down, plus equity capital raising becomes more important. So earnings go up, so the market prices go up. So that's the macro picture based on which we are seeing that the Indian stock markets have been rising, right? So as I talked about it, if you look at it, hence this cyclical growth story of India, the GDP growth of 10.5 for this year and 6.5 for next year, is going to lead to a sharp uptick for the factors around the global liquidity and the factor on Indian growth story to really shoot up from the average level of around 500 to about 800 by next year. So this is why, if you see and draw your attention to the graph on the right hand side first, right? This tells you the key markets 1 year forward PE, right? Because FII flows are a key part, it's important to track this. So the blue line is the S&P 500, right? Can you see it's about 21 forward PE. Then you have Europe coming in. Then you have the topics, which is the Japanese stock exchange. So those are the three big markets. And then you have the emerging market. Can you see that emerging markets are still the most undervalued, if you say, or less richly valued than the other market, despite all of this liquidity coming. Now shift focus to India on the left-hand side. There we have compared. Now the fact is that India has always been at a premium to the MSCI World Index or to the MSCI Emerging Market Index. So can you see that flat line is the line? When it goes below, it's a discount. So at times India has been a discount to the world, but never to the emerging markets. Now what happened, what I have circled at the end of the first graph, if you can see, is that December 17, the markets peaked. Right? India's premium was highest because everything was so hunky-dory. After that, we went into a correction because of our ILFS and NBFC crisis, because of negative inflation in rural India and the compounding before COVID. And then COVID gave a big hammer right at March 2020. So our premiums had collapsed. In fact, versus the world, we went at a discount. Then this whole story that I have told, right, of this path from dollar weakening and all of that led to India's premium rising. And then again, we saw from a valuation perspective, a small correction. But I'd like to draw your attention to this premium with respect to December 17. India is still at a corrected premium over what it was in December 17-18. So we are still way off from our peak premium in terms of 1 year forward PE. So that brings me to the state that we are not as overvalued as people think. Despite the rise in our markets, we are still in the range of what premiums historically we've been experiencing vis-a-vis the world and emerging market. India continues to be at the same level. We are neither overvalued nor are we undervalued. So from that perspective, when you now look at all our three indices, the large cap, the mid cap, the small cap, again, we are all the three indices are still below in their peak, except for the small cap index, where you can see the orange line, that alone is approaching their peak. To look at this number in a little more detail, what you can see is that overall, from the perspective of what's been happening from the last, is that mid and small caps are still underperforming the large caps since the beginning of the year. But these things go through cycles, right? The economic cycles result in the market cycles. I've talked about this a number of times in my webinar. So what I want to point out is, if you look at a true cycle, which was 2003 to 8, the first table, you can see how the Sensex went up 559%, mid cap went up 900%, and small cap 1400%. You can see the wide difference between the same. But when you now look at it from the last phase, where we believe from March 2020, we have started this new economic recovery post the COVID crash, what are you seeing? You're seeing an 88% rise in the Sensex, a 109% rise in the mid cap, and a 144% rise in the small cap. So what it tells you is that, yes, a bull economic cycle story is playing out, but the gap between the large cap, mid cap, and small cap is not as big as truly it is in a cycle, in an upcycle, right? So the cycle has just begun, and as you now go forward, we would normally expect in this bull phase for this to widen, in the sense that over the medium term, the small caps should do better than the mid caps, and the mid caps from the large caps. However, the recent rise, what has happened there is that if you look at it now in this table, the top table, the first line, December 2017, which was the last peak of our markets, the Nifty was at 17.8 forward PE. Today it's at 19.1, a difference of 1.3, which means Nifty is slightly more expensive than it was at the peak of the previous cycle. Correct? Small cap is 19.9, 19.1. So small caps have run up very fast, and they are also at the peak of their valuation. But the story on mid cap is very different. From a forward P of 24, we are today at a forward P of only 14. We are still 10 PE less than the peak. So that's why when you go to the down table, you can see that the NSE mid cap index is trading at a 29% discount to the Nifty, whereas it was trading at a 35% premium to the Nifty in 2017. Similarly, the small cap was at 11% premium. It's now flat, no premium, right? So the small cap index in the near term has a chance to go up another 11% vis-a-vis the Nifty, but the mid cap index has a huge potential to go up 29% to reach its own levels of historic highs, right? So from that point of view, we believe that overall these valuations do appear reasonable. Now, that's a good story, but we have to keep in mind what are the risks to this. First of all, from a risk perspective, if the COVID vaccination story doesn't work and we unabated have COVID, that's the biggest risk. So that's one. Second, we talked about dollar weakness, dollar weakness, dollar weakness. What if the dollar strengthens, right? Which could happen when? If the US numbers of growth come back very, very fast. If suddenly you see housing starts, unemployment, everything looking very good. If the dollar starts strengthening, then it's the reverse of what all I spoke, right? That's another risk. Next, globally, this commodity metals you've seen rally. Oil also has gone from its lows of 40 to around 70. But if oil goes from 70 to 90 to 100, or if commodity rally continues, which is when China, we are saying, has already accounted for the rise that it will not account for. But in case China decides, let it go. Or in case the US strength, US is talking about a $2 trillion infrastructure spending. Announcement has been made. Parliament has to pass it. That's not a guarantee. But if they pass it, then immediately commodity prices could rise, because they will expect US to do huge orders towards steel and cement, because they don't have the enough in their own country. So that could then lead to inflation in the US and the developed world, and that will mean Fed will start pulling back the liquidity. That six-letter word, right, which is the scariest thing for our markets. What is that? Not a six-letter, sorry, five-letter word. It's taper. TAPER. They start parrying, that will cause an earthquakes in the market. That is from an international perspective. Domestic, yes, COVID infection for India also is a key, but sharp rupee depreciation. How could that happen? If oil prices rise, because India imports 80% of its oil, a big part of our currency is because of that. Second, why could rupee depreciate? If FIS start pulling money out, then when the dollar demand comes in from our markets, automatically rupee will weaken. If the rupee weakens, that's again that fresh money will not come in though much because of the rupee being weakening. So that's a risk. India's rating, everything could get affected. Next, we have had a good monsoon outlook so far. keep tracking it and hope that it sustains. But a bad monsoon and the commodity inflation imported, the bad monsoon could lead to food inflation, which is a big part of the domestic market. So imported crude inflation and food inflation could see then RBI get more worried about inflation than about growth, and they will start paring back liquidity. So this risk factor, we have to bear it in mind, in our mind. And so what are the chances of this risk I mentioned? So just look at one thing, right? How is the rest of the world's growth forecast, right? Yes, 2021, I put global excluding US, emerging market in China, Asia excluding Japan, China, India, all. As you can see, India is the fastest growing, but this graph is not about India. It's about the global. So the global growth is about 6.5 expected for 2021 and 4.8. So that's what we need to track. If that's going to go higher than the current predictions, is when those risks will come into play. Number one. Number two, right? If the real GDP, see, global real GDP is already set to overshoot to the pre-COVID level. So the rate of global growth, now global growth is generally good, right? We look at it, but from a stock market perspective, right, because of its implications on liquidity and interest rates, it's not really the most welcome thing if you're a short-term player in the market. For a long-term player, you should welcome global growth because that's what is going to drive exports from countries like India into the advanced countries, right? So based on these views now, the same kind of risks, which are the biggest risks in the market? So I've sized these bubbles based on the size of the risk as the markets think. So the biggest risk for the markets today is the commodity risk. They are very worried about the commodity part because what's happened to China's growth, and that goes up, then it's going to be a huge impact. So markets are worried about commodities as the biggest. Next is the Fed, the tapering, right? Then developed market reopening is a key focus point. Oil prices are a focus point. US is special focus point. Global trade. No, not all of these are risky. Some of these could work in our favor. So these are the things to keep in mind. I have just put the size of them to put you where the more important focus is on. So quick summary now of what all I spoke. It's all right here, what I've spoken in the last 45-50 minutes. But just some points which I did not mention. First, rural India remains strong on the back of a good monsoon. That's number one. There's double-digit Kharif procurement growth, right? The second, I talked about investment cycle, domestic manufacturing PLI, I think we all spoke about, right? Similarly, CapEx and employment are set to revamp the manufacturing landscape. All this. COVID has pushed in India into a phase of formalization, which had resisted during demonetization. So next, of course, I've talked about the e-commerce related firms and financial technology disruption is a big part of the services sector. Housing PLI we spoke about, and all the rest, I think we have all these are covered. It's just a quick summary for all of you, right? So from Sundaram's portfolio perspective, right, what I'd like to tell you is that from our perspective, right, we have to constantly price in the evolving situation on the ground. Reasonable valuation is still important, though growth focus can't be known. We are twin cylinders are the investment cycle resurgence and the consumption story post the second wave as a pickup, right? As a demand, pent up demand pickup. That's what we tracking, right? So for us, domestic growth recovery will be played through quality financial companies, banks and NBFCs, discretionary consumption, which includes auto, which I've mentioned there, building materials and industrials. Any global recovery, we'd like to play it through metals, specialty chemicals, essentially export-oriented sectors like auto ancillaries and IT services. Apart from this, Indian IT companies, we believe, are benefiting from this multi-year cloud migration and the digital transformation that's globally happening. But we still believe that stock selection is more and more important rather than just a macro play. And we think that with the improved economic environment, mid and small caps, we are likely to see a rising participation. So that summarizes our presentation. Thank you very much for your patience and listening.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.